listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with you for the briefing. Footage of Australian Senator and Gurnai Gunditjmara and Djab-Wurrung woman Lidia Thorpe shouting at King Charles in Parliament this week has made headlines around the world.
You are not our king! You are not sovereign! Give us our land back! Give us what you stole from us! We want freedom in this country!
Opposition leader Peter Dutton has called on Senator Thorpe to resign following the protest. Many people have pointed out that Thorpe pledged allegiance to the monarch when she was sworn in as a senator. In a slightly absurd turn of events, Thorpe now says she didn't really swear loyalty to the Queen's heirs, as in King Charles, but to her heirs. This has all gotten a bit silly now, but there are genuine questions about whether Thorpe can or should stay in Parliament having disavowed her oath, whether it's fair to ask a First Nations person to pledge allegiance to the monarchy, and what about all those MPs that want Australia to become a republic? What about their loyalty to the Crown? Here to help us wade through all these questions is Luke Beck, Professor of Constitutional Law at Monash University. Luke, thanks so much for joining us. Can Lidia Thorpe remain a senator?
The short answer to that is yes, she can remain a senator unless something happens that causes her to be disqualified. And I don't think as yet anything has happened that would cause her to be disqualified.
Okay, let's have a listen to what she said when she took her oath of office.
I, Lidia Thorpe, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors according to law.
Senator Thorpe, please sign the test roll and Senator's roll.
So that's what she said at the time, and this is now what she has just told the ABC.
And I swore allegiance to the Queen's heirs. If you listen close enough, it wasn't her heirs, it was her heirs that I was giving my allegiance to. And now that, they're no longer here, I don't know where that stands.
So as we heard, she did actually say the word heirs, but she did sign a document that says heirs, which would mean King Charles. Does what she said overtake what she signed, or the other way around?
If we just take a step back, what are actually the rules? The Constitution says that every member of the House of Representatives, so that's every MP and every senator, before they take their seat, must take either the oath or affirmation as set out in the Constitution. So politicians can choose a secular affirmation or a religious oath, depending on what they want. But other than that, the words are as set out in the Constitution. And the Constitution says they must do that before taking their seat. We might remember when Lidia Thorpe first got elected to Parliament, she tried to take a different affirmation. She referred to herself as a sovereign woman. And the Senate president said, no, the rules are that you have to take the official oath or affirmation. Please do it again properly. And now, as it turns out, she swapped one of the words around, it seems, heir rather than heir. But does failing to take the oath or affirmation properly have any legal impact? So that is an internal matter of the Senate. It's not an official ground of disqualification. So even if we were to say, no, she did not do the oath or affirmation properly, it's not like you or I or any other member of the public can go to court and say, this politician is disqualified from Parliament. It's an entirely internal matter for the Senate. So that what the Senate will have to do next time they meet, if they want to do something about this, is to say, well, do we think she has actually taken the affirmation properly given the document that she signed? Or do we think she has not done it properly given what we understand to be the words that she spoke? And if they take that second view, they can say, well, look, Senator Thorpe, we told you before you have to do it properly. Now please do it again properly. If she chooses not to do that, then the Senate has a choice to make. Do they just drop it and let it go and just carry on with getting on with the business of Parliament? Or do they say, well, actually, no, the Constitution says that you have to take the oath or affirmation before taking your seat. So we're not going to let you participate in the Senate proceedings unless and until you do it properly. That's up to the Senate to decide. So if they wanted to take that view, there's a whole bunch of ifs here, cascading ifs. They could say, well, actually, do it properly or don't participate. And then there's a trickier issue If they go down that path, and then if she does not attend the Senate chamber for 2 consecutive months, then we get into then that might possibly make her seat vacant. But that's a whole bunch of ifs. Now, politically, I don't think any of that's going to happen. It would seem that part of the goal here on the part of Lidia Thorpe is to draw attention to herself, right? And she's been quite successful in that. Like, people have been talking about her for the past couple of days, her protest in front of the King and Queen, and now this thing about heirs versus heirs. And some of the senior politicians on the Liberal Party side in the Senate had made this observation that, she might want a consequence. She might want to be formally censured by the Senate so she can say, look, they're being mean to me. Look, they're having a go at me. So there's a politically tricky issue here about what, if anything, they might want to do politically. But the solution to all of this is basically political. So yes, it would seem there might possibly be a case of she didn't follow the constitutional rules in taking the oath for affirmation properly, but it's an internal proceeding of Parliament. And a really fundamental constitutional rule is what happens inside the chamber is a matter for the chamber. The courts don't get involved.
So one of those ifs that you mentioned is if they decide that she cannot participate in the Senate because she didn't properly take the oath when she started. She has signed off laws as a member of Parliament. Is there any legal problem with the laws that she voted into law?
No. So if she didn't take the oath of affirmation properly, or if in a different situation, we remember a few years ago with the Section 44 dual citizenship disqualification situation, a whole bunch of senators and MPs voted for and against laws that came into force, and it turns out those people were disqualified from Parliament. Those laws were not invalidated, so there's no risk of any of the laws passed by federal Parliament being invalidated. That's absolutely not an issue. So there's no argument to make that. That's very clear.
Has anything like this ever happened, to your knowledge, in the Australian Parliament?
Oh, well, so we have the precedent of Lidia Thorpe a couple of years ago when she first got sworn in. She didn't take the oath properly, and they said, no, got to come back and do it properly. As a general proposition, people who get elected to Parliament are quite pleased about getting elected to Parliament. They put their hand up, they nominated, they campaigned really hard, spent a lot of time and energy and money doing it. And so they're quite keen to get down to business, right? That's why they put their hand up. There's a debate, and Lidia Thorpe has hinted at this a couple of times, that the oath of affirmation requires parliamentarians to affirm or swear their allegiance to the monarch. And so people who are Republicans think, well, actually, my loyalty is not to King Charles or previously Queen Elizabeth. My loyalty is to the people. I'd prefer to swear my loyalty or affirm my loyalty to the people. In New South Wales, they made constitutional amendments in 2006 to their state constitution to allow their MPs, instead of swearing allegiance to the king, to pledge loyalty to the people. But the federal constitution, which is what applies to the federal parliament and the federal Senate, says that you must use the oath or affirmation set out at the end of the constitution, and that the words are all about swearing allegiance to the king. So the only way to change that would be by way of referendum, and the odds of having a special referendum to change the oath of office for MPs and senators is rather slim, I would suggest.
Incredibly slim, you'd think. By signing up as a senator to the existing Commonwealth Parliament, the existing constitution that we have, that includes the monarchy. But Lidia Thorpe's argument is sovereignty was never ceded, Parliament operates on stolen land. Is it unreasonable to ask a First Nations woman to declare her allegiance to, in her words, the coloniser?
Well, so this is part of the issue. So Lidia Thorpe is not the only First Nations person in Parliament. There's a whole bunch of other Indigenous people, both in the lower house and the upper house, and they've taken the oath of affirmation. So there is an issue around, people have these arguments around the consequences of colonisation and so on. But the reality is the constitutional rules require you to do this if you want to take your seat. And there's also this sort of related issue when people say sovereignty was never ceded. People are using sovereignty in all sorts of different senses, and lots of people who use that expression are not necessarily talking in a legal sense. The absolute fact and reality of the matter is that the Commonwealth of Australia is a legitimate functioning state, right? The Constitution is binding on us all, whether we like it or not, right? Now, when some people say sovereignty was never ceded, they're talking about sovereignty in a slightly different non-legal sense. And that's fair enough, and people can put those views about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples having special connections to the lands and waters. And some people might be trying to use that in a legal sense, but in a legal sense, that's legally incorrect. But it is an interesting situation, leaving that aside, about a person who has voluntarily chosen to run for the Senate, for the Parliament to say, I don't really accept the authority of the Parliament in which she sits, in which she is a lawmaker. She has more power and privilege than you. You and I don't get to sit and vote yes or no on particular laws or introduce bills, but she does. So there's a question about what is her goal here? And it's not 100% clear what her practical goal is here, because if we look at the consequences of this over the past day or so, we're talking about her. We're talking about, really arcane issues about oaths and affirmations in Parliament that most people have never wanted to think about in their lives and hopefully will never have to think about again.
If you are someone who doesn't believe that Australia should have a king or a queen, should you resign from Parliament?
No, not at all. So there have been lots of Republicans in Parliament. So you might remember the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. Many years before going into Parliament, he was head of the Australian Republican movement. So there's been a whole bunch of Republicans who've sat in Parliament and, in fact, voted to try and change the Constitution to get rid of the monarchy. So it's not inconsistent with being a Republican, being anti-monarchy, to be a member of Parliament and to swear allegiance to the King.
I don't like the colony. I don't like the King and what he represents. And I don't like the fact that I've got to swear to an oppressor to do my job to get justice for my people.
It is really antiquated, right? Like, that's not how we would do it today if we were starting again. We'd probably go down that New South Wales path of having people pledge loyalty to the people that they've been elected to represent. But you've got to remember that this Constitution was written in the 1800s, and so it reflects some of the things of the time. But when we're talking about the King of Australia, or the Queen of Australia as in the past, we're not talking about that person personally as an individual. We're talking about that person as the embodiment of the nation state, as an embodiment of Australia. Now, that seems really weird. How on earth is this English bloke the embodiment of Australia? But if you think from the 1800s, that's kind of how it worked. And so what we're really doing when we're saying pledge loyalty to the King is that you're ultimately pledging your loyalty in reality to the Commonwealth of Australia.
Just looking ahead, What are the possible things that could be the outcome of this whole event?
Option 1, nothing happens. The Senate just carries on. Option 2, they tell her, make the affirmation again, do it properly, please. Option 3, one of the above, and or, pass some kind of censure motion, which is kind of like an official statement. We think you've done something wrong. We think you've been naughty. Here, have a slap on the wrist, but it has no sort of legal consequence. But I think politicians from the major parties and maybe from the other crossbenchers as well would probably really prefer to get on with the business of Parliament and probably wouldn't want to give this issue more oxygen. It might be that the other members of the Senate take the view that this is an independent crossbench senator seeking attention and we probably shouldn't give it any more oxygen. But time will tell.
It certainly will. Luke Beck, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Great to be here.
Luke Beck, Professor of Constitutional Law at Monash University there. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we're on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow from 6. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.